Okay, friends, you'll have to bear with me tonight. I'm in a bit of a silly mood because I got my hair cut yesterday and I'm kind of excited about that, really pumped. Uh, First time I've had a haircut since last February. Uh, Secondly, I wanted to share with you a couple of thoughts before we begin. Uh, First of all, I told you, been asked several times about what is the best version of the Quran to utilize in your own study. And I had said the Yosef Ali, and I realized that that really isn't helpful for you because of the way the columns, it's going for one thing, it's going from the back to the front to keep in line with, of course, with the Arabic, which reads from right to left. And that's kind of confusing, plus the fact that the lines are very cropped to keep, so each line represents an according line in the Arabic. So I think I'm going to recommend that you use the Rodwell. Now, the Rodwell, if I described it and showed you, was in chronological order. And I noticed on Amazon today that there are very few of those that are available from the original chronological order, though there are some paperback versions that are in the standard order. But Rodwell really is, his lines aren't line for line. Sometimes he'll be a line off, and so far as the numbering, sometimes a couple of lines, but you can figure that out. But it really is a lot easier read when you're, reading a surah and you want to get the sense of it. So I changed my mind on that. I get the Rodwell if you can. Second thing, we're getting closer, of course, to our transition from Islam into the Baha'i faith. Of course, we've really been transitioning since the beginning because we compare everything we're discussing with what the Baha'i writings say about the religion or the text that we're studying. And so you would do well. We're going to spend about 3, maybe 4 more classes on Islam, but all of the things we're going to be dealing with now are tying us into things that are picked up by or paralleled in the Baha'i text. One thing I would strongly suggest is that you read the introduction to the Dawnbreakers that the Guardian, of course, the Guardian edited and translated the Dawnbreakers, an incredible piece of work. But he also wrote a very helpful introduction, and particularly an introduction where he quotes from Lord Curzon, or however it's pronounced, about the Qajar dynasty and what the social, religious, and governmental context was at the time of of Sheikh Ahmad Sid Kazim and the declaration of the Bab. So that you'll find that very helpful. Also, as we discussed the Qaim, which we'll get into in either tonight or a couple of classes, I've already got the other classes laid out, but I forget the order. But at any rate, you'll remember when Mullah Hossein has his discussion with the Bab on the evening of the Bab's declaration, he gives the requisites for what will characterize the Qaim. And so you would do well to look at that part of the Dawnbreakers where Mullah Hussein's own description of what that night was like. It's a rather remarkable thing. The organization of the YouTube channel, I added, without warning you about it, some what I think are helpful auxiliary or ancillary videos about such things. Some of the things we've discussed, some parts I've shown you. One individual sent me a link to the ornament, which is about the influence of Islam as it became embedded into Andalusia primarily in Spain, and just the influence of the learning at Cordoba and so on. And so I included that and several others. Look at those as you wish. and I'll refer to them as becomes necessary, and I'll organize the YouTube channel so that it's maybe a little clearer visually. But look at those as you wish. And if you have questions on those, hold them till we get to that point of our discussion. Finally, all the suggestions or any suggestions you have about videos you know about online are welcome. Please email them to me or links to them. I did include one that I think is, I've listened to it maybe 10 or 20 times at least, and that is, it's a YouTube recording of what was originally a wire recording made in 1957, shortly after The Guardian had deceased, by Leroy Owens, called In the Days of the Guardian. It's an incredible piece of work, a little hard to understand some parts of it because of the recording quality, but you can understand it sufficiently well. So tonight we're finishing up our discussion about the concept of spreading religion by the sword, about and the relativity of justice as it is demonstrated not only by Muhammad, but also we're going to already get into the Baha'i concept of jihad and of both, well, the various definitions of it. I'm going to repeat just very briefly here something we've already seen last time, and that was the conquest of Muhammad is in green, and then the area up here, the what I call a dark pink, that's the Sassanid Empire, Persian Empire, which is responsible later on, much later on, for turning Persia into a Shiite brand of Islam. And then what I call a light purple over the left here, that's the Byzantine Empire, which is has a very important role. It was Christian at this point, Eastern Christian, and it lasted for almost 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire did. And it was the one that built the church of the Sophia Hagia, and or Hagia Sophia, I forget which it is, in Constantinople, which is a remarkable church and now a remarkable mosque. And we'll see how that goes. So what you're seeing here is that all of the area that had been unified under Muhammad was sort of pinned in by these other two empires for the time being. So the black lines are the further expanse of Islam under the caliphs, under the first caliphate, which would be the Rashidan Caliphate. They're called the first four. They're the first four caliphs, and they're the ones that individually knew and were followers of Muhammad during his life. The last one of those is Ali, who of course is was the first imam. Now, the reason I did this, if you remember last week, is because two of these, the one here going up to the Battle of Tabuk, and then one down here, one is the Battle of Hunayn in 630, and the other is the Battle of Tabuk in 630 also. And these were not defensive battles. In other words, all the battles we've seen so far were defensive. And so the concept of jihad, insofar as spreading the concept that it's usually used today, and that's spreading the religion by force, though you're not really spreading religious beliefs, you're just conquering people, which is pretty much what happened to Islam after Muhammad. I wanted to include those and repeat that since that's our topic tonight. And I put here in my own words, I know that if Muhammad instigated an expedition to bring them enlightenment and force was used, it will, once all the circumstances are understood, be understood to be naught but manifest justice. And that naught but manifest justice is a phrase from Baha'u'llah, which I loved dearly, the phrase. And what he's talking about is that the laws and actions of the manifestation may seem totally uh, uh, inconceivable in some cases to the people to whom the manifestation appears until you understand the logic behind it. And so we'll get to that in a second. But this is a quote from Abdul Baha in Some Answered Questions, and we've read it before, but we'll go over it quickly now. If this oppression, the oppression that befell Muhammad, had fallen only upon himself, he would have forgiven them. In other words, even as Christ says, if someone hits you, to turn the other cheek and so on. We're going to deal with the comparison of the law of retribution for oppression in just a second. He would have forgiven them, and such an act of forgiveness would have been most praiseworthy. But if he had seen that these cruel and bloodthirsty murderers wished to kill, to pillage, to injure all these oppressed ones, and to take captive the women and children, it is certain that he would have protected them and would have resisted the tyrants. What objection then can be taken to Muhammad's action? Is it this, that he did not with his followers and their women and children submit to these savage tribes? To free these tribes. Now here's where he gets into this concept of but how do you justify his going into conquering tribes that had not attacked him first? And this is, if you will, the explanation of the logic. To free these tribes from their bloodthirstiness was the greatest kindness, and to coerce and restrain them was a true mercy. They were like a man, and you remember this image from last class, they were like a man holding in his hand a cup of poison, which when about to drink, a friend breaks and thus saves him, breaks the cup. If Christ had been placed in similar circumstances as Muhammad was, it is certain that with a conquering power, he would have delivered the men, women, and children from the claws of these bloodthirsty wolves. So we have the Battle of Hunayn. I will let you read this on your own. Suffice it to say, this was one where he had a decisive victory. And it's the only one that's actually mentioned and discussed in the Quran. And you see the passages from Surah 9, verses 25 through 26. Behold, your great numbers elated you, but they availed you not. The land, for all that is wide, did constrain you, and ye turned back in retreat. But Allah did pour his calm on the messenger, on Muhammad, and on the believers, and sent down forces which ye saw not, we presume spiritual forces. He punished the unbelievers, thus doth he reward those without faith. And of course, the reward there is meant, thus does he repay those who are without belief. We can discuss that more later if that interests you, but the same thing is true with the expedition of Tabuk, which had to do in the north with his defense of the trade routes from Mecca and Medina up to Damascus and Syria, and the Byzantine invasion, which you saw on this map here, which would have been, here is Damascus here, and you can see that he wanted to be sure that he defended this trade route, which was the lifeblood, if you will, of Mecca and Medina. I've repeated the map here with designating which areas are which, but I've already explained that to you. So this is the Byzantium, the Empire of the Byzantium. You might want to read up on that. And this is the Sassanid Persian Empire, which lasted a good while. and which was originally Zoroastrian in influence, but they are the ones that ultimately are responsible for the fact that Persia becomes followers of the Shia sect of Islam, while all the countries around them on the east, what is now Afghanistan and so on, and the west, which would be Iraq and so on, became Sunni. So we deal with the subject of tonight, which is the relativity of justice. What is justice? As I've said before, many classes ago, when I examined this subject in an early book I wrote called The Purpose of Physical Reality, I came to the conclusion that the most encompassing concept of justice, and this hooks in, of course, with the hidden word that justice, the most precious thing in my sight is justice, and that we should cleave unto it. But is that justice is ultimately doing what is appropriate given the exigencies of a particular situation and given the spiritual laws that apply. In other words, it's not a fixed point. It depends. It's what was called in the 60s. It was a big deal in Christian Protestant theology called moral, what was it? Conditional morality or something like that. I forget the exact term, but the idea was that you couldn't have a fixed point of morality. It depended on the conditions or circumstances that applied in any given incident. So as we look at what is appropriate or just, we have to consider who the people are that are being taught, what are their conditions insofar as their education, their experience. So Judaism, as Moses teaches it, teaches a concept of retributive justice, both on the individual and the collective level. And so you have, interestingly, many Christians quoting this, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which of course is not Christian at all. This is the Judaic idea. And this makes sense in as much as they are, as I say here, a tribal people newly released from captivity and years of enslavement. So they have no education, they have no cultural orientation, they have escaped, and now Moses has to raise them up from the dust, basically, and educate them and teach them these fundamental ideas of structure and justice, social structure and justice. And interestingly, to me, as a teacher of Old and Middle English, because the Anglo-Saxon tribes and all other tribal societies have this exact same concept of reciprocal justice or retributive justice, that if you take a man's life, then the family of that people have the right to take your life or the financial equivalent thereof. Christianity, of course, Christ abrogates this law. And he says, you have heard it said, and we went over this when we studied Christianity, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that you resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. He doesn't say what happens after that, because we've only got two cheeks, of course. And so that's, again, the chapters 5 through 7 in Matthew, where Christ reveals his laws, and that's one of them. So is this true on just the individual level, or is it on the societal level as well? Well, we don't know, because Christ doesn't set up an institution for dealing with this, though he does allude in his laws to bringing things before the council. And the only council that existed then was the Sanhedrin. Mohammed employs a mixture of tribal retributive justice, because he is also dealing with peoples in rudimentary tribal circumstances, perhaps as bad as or worse than what Moses was dealing with, because they don't even have a unified experience. You have the Bedouins, you have the Jewish tribes, you have the idol worshiping tribes, and so on. So it's an incredible situation he's faced with, how to unify peoples with totally different experiences, totally different ethical perspectives, and so on. And so he mixes tribal justice, which is an eye for an eye, retributive justice, with a constitution, which is called, of course, the Constitution of Medina we've talked about, which is a participatory form of governance. Not down to the individual so much, but as the different groups responsible for their particular part of the community. And so we can only glean about his concept of justice from the three sources that constitute the totality of his revelation, which is the Quran, the Hadith, which are things that he is said to have said and were copied down, but he was not in a revelatory trance, and the Sunnah, which are the pattern of actions that he demonstrated in his life, as well as the actions and writings of the Imams, who we are told were infallible, told in the Baha'i writings. Well, what about the Baha'i faith? Now, this is where we get to a very interesting thing insofar as the relativity of justice is concerned. And this is my own excuse me, my own writing here, but we get to Baha'u'llah. We'll actually Shoghi Effendi talking about Baha'u'llah in the Agdas right here. The Baha'i faith teaches forgiveness on a personal level, but punishment on the societal level, even reciprocal in some cases. For example, Baha'u'llah gives the punishment for 4 different offenses or breaches of law. These are murder, arson, stealing, and adultery. Though the one on adultery is really about fornication, that is sexual intercourse outside the bounds of marriage. We're not going to go into all those at this point. We will when we get to the Agdas. But the one thing you need to know is this, that you don't have case law, as I understand it, we will not, and we do not now. Because right now you have with the local spiritual assembly, which is a forerunner of the local House of Justice, the National Spiritual Assembly, which is the forerunner of the National or Territorial House of Justice, or Secondary House of Justice, it will be called, and you don't with the Universal House of Justice. By case law, I mean that each offense or each problem is dealt with regarding the exigencies of the circumstances in which if it's a breach of law, in which the breach has occurred. So you may have before a local assembly 2 people with the exact same problem in some senses. They are habitual alcoholics, or they and have been warned repeatedly before. What do you do? As an assembly, how do you deal with these people? Well, you have to deal with each case is dealt with separately. You can't say, well, we did this for this last person, so we must do this in this case. In the Agdas, Baha'u'llah has given death as the penalty for murder. However, he has permitted life imprisonment as an alternative. I have a whole article on this on my website that I have presented, the Baha'i model of penology. And you might do well to listen to that if this subject interests you. Both practices would be in accordance with his laws. Some of us may not be able to grasp the wisdom of this when it disagrees with our own limited vision. But we must accept it knowing his wisdom, his mercy, and his justice are perfect and for the salvation of the entire world. And this is very important here. If a man were falsely condemned to die, we cannot believe Almighty God would not compensate him 1,000-fold in the next world for this human injustice. you cannot give up a salutary law because on rare occasions the innocent may be punished. Now, this is a very good response on a societal level to those who think that capital punishment is just a priori wrong. You don't have society taking a person's life. Well, we can discuss this at length later. We can discuss a little bit tonight if you wish. But the idea is that obviously, if someone has been murdered, you already have one innocent person who's died. If someone else gives their life at the hands of a faulty judgment, you can presume that they would have something like the status of a martyr because they, in effect, have given their life to help deter further criminal acts. So it is seen as a deterrence. And so these are two principles we'll get at in more depth later, but laws in the Agdas that are dealing with the concept of penology, and this is discussed at further length by Abdu'l-Baha, are meant to be a deterrent, but they should never be vengeful. Society has no right to take revenge. Its purpose is to uphold social order. And that alone. It is for God to judge the person. But a second principle at work you'll find in the punishments of Baha'u'llah is alternative possible responses. And again, obviously those are dependent on, again, the exigencies. And this is an axiom here from Baha'u'llah, from Gleanings. Know verily that the essence of justice and the source thereof are both embodied in the ordinances prescribed by him who is the manifestation of the self of God amongst men. If you be of them that recognize this truth, in other words, if you understand what I'm talking about, he doth verily incarnate the highest, the infallible standard of justice unto all creation. Were his laws, and this is particularly important, were his law to be such as to strike terror into the hearts of all that are in heaven on earth, that law is naught but manifest justice. And you can see here is where I got that term, manifest justice. So if we look at Muhammad's actions, particularly what is sometimes called jihad, and you say, well, this is totally unjustified. It is not but manifest justice if, number one, you believe that he was a manifestation of God, and number two, you look into all the exigent circumstances in which the action was undertaken. And this is from Baha'u'llah as well. The fears and agitation which the revelation of this law provokes in men's hearts should indeed be likened to the cries of the suckling babe weaned from its mother's milk, if you be of them that perceive. And again, this cautionary statement here, if you understand what I'm talking about. Were men to discover the motivating purpose of God's revelation, they would assuredly cast away their fears, and with hearts filled with gratitude, rejoice with exceeding gladness. In other words, if you only knew what the ultimate goal and purpose of these laws was, you would just delight because you'd see that the whole purpose is for your benefit. And so we have several things that even as Baha'is, we don't understand yet, and which we're told we are not to understand yet. One of them, of course, is why are there no women allowed on the House of Justice? And we're told that it has nothing to do with the equality of men and women. It has to do with exigent circumstances that you will know in time when it's timely. And when you do, you will know it as clear as the sun at midday. And in effect, when you know, you'll know you know, and you won't have any more questions. It'll be very clear. The passages here, which continues on the second slide here, by Abdu'l-Baha, is sort of summarizes this whole thing I'm getting at, and that is, you have a relativity of justice that is distinct between what is just between two individuals and what is just between the community and its members. And it's very interesting because if you serve on an LSA and you're having to deal with personal problems, and especially this is true when the Baha'i administrative becomes governmental bodies, but even now they are, you have to realize that, oh, so-and-so did this, but we must show mercy, we must show love. No, here Abdul Baha says, that's not your job. Let me read it first. To recapitulate, the constitution of the communities depends upon justice, not forgiveness. Then what Christ meant by forgiveness and pardon, turn the other cheek, in other words, is not that when nations attack you, you burn your homes, plunder your goods, assault your wives, children and relatives, and violate your honor, you should be submissive in the presence of these tyrannical foes and allow them to perform all their cruelties and oppressions. No, the words of Christ refer to the contact of two individuals towards each other. If one person assaults another, the injured one should forgive him. But the communities must protect the rights of man. So if someone assaults, injures, oppresses, and wounds me, I will offer no resistance and I will forgive him. But if a person wishes to assault Sayyid Manshadi, this is a fictional character he's made up, certainly I will prevent him. Although for the malefactor, non-interference is apparently a kindness, it would be an oppression to Manshadi. And of course, you have the example, if you recall many classes ago, about Moses killing the Egyptian who was attacking a Samaritan. And Moses had to kill the Egyptian to prevent that murder from occurring. If at this moment a wild Arab were to enter this place with a drawn sword, and that may sound like it's anti-Arab, but it's not, as you will understand when we get into discussing the Baha'i situation at this time, wishing to assault, wound, and kill you, most assuredly I would prevent him. And if I abandoned you to the Arab, that would not be justice, but injustice. But if he injured me personally, I would forgive him. So, how does jihad fit into these various definitions of justice? Because whatever jihad does mean, and it has various meanings, it must somehow comply with these concepts of justice. I just remembered the term, about the Christian term, situational morality, it was called. Jihad is an Arabic word which literally means striving or struggling, especially with a praiseworthy objective in mind. It doesn't mean necessarily a physical struggle. In fact, the greatest jihad is an inner striving. The word jihad appears frequently in the Quran with and without military connotations, often in the idiomatic expression, striving in the path of God or struggling in the path of God, of course, which is an interior or internal struggle that we all undergo and never cease struggling, hopefully. So at least three meanings emerge when we consider the term in an Islamic context. It can refer to almost any effort to make personal and social life conform with God's guidance, such as a struggle against one's evil inclination, proselytizing, or efforts towards the moral betterment of the ummah, the community, though it is most frequently associated with war. In classical Islamic law, the term refers to armed struggle against unbelievers, while modernist Islamic scholars generally equate military jihad with defensive warfare. And of course, that's what the Babis experience when they are attacked in the various communities by government forces, egged on by the mullahs and the mujtahids in their community. In Sufi and pious circles, spiritual and moral jihad has been traditionally emphasized under the name of greater jihad. The term has gained additional attention in recent decades through its use by terrorist groups. So what is the use of the term jihad in the context of Babi and Baha'i history? Because you will find some Baha'i scholars saying, well, what the Babis did at Fort Tarbarsi or at Zanjan or at Neriz, this was jihad. Well, they did fight, but they were defending themselves, and each one ended the same way. The government forces say, and they swore on the Quran, that if you will stop this defending yourselves and come out peacefully, you will not be harmed. And of course, in each, because they swore on the Quran, the Babis said, well, we have to comply. And each time they came out, they were slaughtered or imprisoned or persecuted in other ways. Shoghi Effendi uses extract from Lord Curzon's Persia and the Persian Question, pages 38 through 58 in the introduction to Nabil's narrative, and that's what I want you to read, at least that, but the totality of his introduction. But the article is called Persia's State of Decadence in the Middle of the 19th Century. And it's particularly valuable because he was not a Baha'i, and so his observations are objectively, presumably unbiased, but they're very profound. The need to know the context in order to understand and appreciate all that Nabil describes, some of which is beyond the credulity of the Western mind. I remember when I first read it, now that we've seen with ISIS and the various other Islamic jihadist undertakings, it doesn't surprise us at all. But the mere beheading, which seems just uncanny to us, is not the least of what happens to the Babis. And I told you that last time when I first read this, I couldn't believe that this really had happened, and only, less than 100 years ago at the time I was reading it. The extensive secular sources cited, including the French footnotes to Nabil, which are pretty gruesome, from observers to the debasing, ignominious, inhuman, and unjust treatment of the Babis. In the context of Babi and Baha'i history, the themes of jihad and martyrdom, now here we get to another tricky question, and that is, what is relationship of jihad and martyrdom? Because both come to the fore in the history of the Babi movement and also in the Baha'i movement. The Bab often wrote theoretically about jihad in the sense of armed struggle, but he never explicitly announced the beginning of a jihad, a holy war. And he completely undermines the concept of jihad by defining holy war in a way as to make it contingent on impossible conditions. In other words, where there's no alternatively, such as Fort Tarbarsi, thus nullifying it. The various Babi struggles involved solely defensive jihad. But then there's a question of martyrdom, which many new to the faith or studying the faith or in the faith find sometimes troublesome. How is this valuable to allow yourself to be slaughtered? An immensely important theme in Shi'ism. It was also important to the Babis as well, with the siege of the fort that they constructed at the shrine of Sheikh Tarbarsi, being viewed as a Baha'i recapitulation of the events of Karbala. And what they're talking about there is a recapitulation of when the troops of the caliphate surrounded the small gathering of the Imam Hussein, and slaughtered him, cut his head off, and debased him. Hundreds of individual Babis were martyred in public, usually in ways that inspired admiration or even allegiance to their cause. And all more than 20,000 Babis were slaughtered by government forces during this period, which the height of it is really beginning after the Conference of Badasht, which we'll get to, which occurred in the summer of 1848. And that fall, the battle at Tabarsi begins and goes all the way into the spring. It was to his, Baha'u'llah's, counsels and exhortations addressed to the occupants of Sheikh Tabarsi, who had welcomed him with such reverence and love during his visit to that fort, that must be attributed in no small measure the spirit evinced by its heroic defenders, while it was to his explicit instructions that they owed the miraculous release of Khodus and his consequent association with them in the stirring exploits that have immortalized the Mazindaran upheaval. This is from God Passes By. It was for the sake of those same defenders whom he had intended to enjoin. So he himself was going to take part in the defense of the fort, that he suffered his second imprisonment. He was on the way to the fort, and I read this last time, when he was captured. He was in the Masjid of Amul, the town of Amul, to which he was led. This is the occasion, if you remember, those of you who've been a Baha'i for some time, about the woman who was to throw a rock at him as he was walked without a headdress through the heckling crowd, and someone stopped her, and he said, "No, do not stop this woman from doing what she perceives to be a praiseworthy act in the eyes of God." And there he was bastinadoed, and we read this last time, and here is what a bastinado looks like. You can see that the individual's feet are strapped to a crossbar, and then his feet are beat with a rod, usually an iron rod, on the arches, usually breaking the feet, causing them to bleed. And as I say, often the individual will never be able to walk or walk well again. This happened to Baha'u'llah. This was his first imprisonment. So we finish up with a few words about the military imagery, which also disturbs some people, that's used in the writings of Baha'u'llah, and the station of martyrdom as we continue discussing it. And we're just going to look at a few passages, and then we'll have some discussion. The Baha'i writings often employ military imagery, and the answer, why? Because it works well. It's effective. In the same way that the Baha'i writings often use wine imagery, the choice wine, imbibing the choice wine of the laws of Baha'u'llah. Well, he says that, that the laws unlock, or in effect, unseal the wine and of course you have here, if you remember all the way back in Christianity, when we're talking about that Christ says about his revelation, you can't put new wine in old bottles. And so you need both a new revelation, a new wine, but you also need a container for that wine, which is the administrative order. And so the wine that Baha'u'llah is talking about is, in general, his spiritual writings and teachings, such as the Igan, and what contains it is the administrative order, which is outlined in the Agdas. In the same way that with Muhammad, you have the Quran, which outlines the spiritual teachings and some of the social teachings, but you have the Ummah, the Constitution of Medina, which was his design for a social implementation of those, though he never got to, that never got to be enforced. So you have terms like entry by troops, army of light, army of God, teaching campaign, the military men. This is, you can take this if you want to. It's a decent article by Jack McLean, and this is the hot link to it, which you can download from the slides, where he talks about both the military metaphor in particular, but also the wine imagery in the sacred writings of Baha'u'llah. And one of the points he makes is we talk about wine imagery, but we don't drink wine. It's a similar problem. So I quoted for you just for your benefit here to see some of the usage of the military imagery. Then shall the knights of the Lord, assisted by his grace from on high, strengthened by faith, aided by the power of understanding and reinforced by the legions of the covenant, arise and make manifest the truth of the verse, behold the confusion that hath befallen the tribes of the defeated. O army of God, today in this world, every people is wandering astray in its own desert, moving here and there according to the dictates of its fancies and whims, pursuing its own particular caprice. Amongst all the teeming masses of the earth, only this community of the most great name is free and clear of human schemes and hath no selfish purpose to promote. So the army of God image, army of light. In spite all of their efforts, the sun of truth shone from the horizon. In every case, the army of light vanquished the powers of darkness on the battlefield of the world, and the radiance of the divine teaching illuminated the earth. So there again, you see the effectiveness of the imagery. So it's military, it's militaristic in its imagery, but not in its intent, other than the, well, again, you can't summarize a good image in a word or two, so I won't try here. Here again, another one, and will this be the last one, is capturing the cities of men's hearts. I love this because all of these that I've highlighted here are military images, spiritual battalions, and he compares it to the apostles of Christ on the southern shores of the European continent, how they in effect overwhelmed the forces in Europe. And the author of the plan, Baha'u'llah, has set so titanic an enterprise in motion, is himself mounted at the head of these battalions. Of course, it's not literal, and leads them on to capture the cities of men's hearts. Isn't that beautiful? So the cities that you're attacking, if you will, are trying to overwhelm are men's hearts. Well, now we finish up with the idea of martyrdom. And I've got three hidden words here, two, excuse me, both of which are dealing with the concept of martyrdom. To tinge thy hair with blood is greater in my sight than the creation of the universe and the light of both worlds. Strive then to attain this, O servant. So it sounds like we should all give our lives. Well, the same thing here. Write all that we have written unto thee with the ink of light upon the tablet of thy spirit, which would sound like to me some sort of intellectual enlightenment. So if you can, use what we have revealed to you to enlighten yourself. But if you're unable to do that, if you don't have the education or the opportunity, then make thy ink the essence of thy heart. That would imply to me love, then just give love. If this you cannot do, then simply give your life. Shed in thy path. If this thou cannot do, then write with the crimson ink that hath been shed in my path. This would imply, then just give your life. Sweeter indeed is this to me than all else, that its light may endure forever. Now, Lucia and I had a lot of discussion about this week, and it is her contention, and I agree with it, that these are all dealing with action, not shedding of your blood for the cause of God. And this seems to underscore it here. This is a discussion of it as yet untranslated tablet by Baha'u'llah, the Law Miriam, the tablet to Mary, his sister. We'll talk about that another time. In one of his letters to the believers of the East, Shoghi Effendi has attributed all the great victories of the cause in the Western world, including the conversion to the faith of Queen Marie of Romania, to the mysterious forces released by the blood of the countless martyrs in Persia. However, in this dispensation, Baha'u'llah has exhorted his followers not to seek martyrdom. So that seems pretty clear, doesn't it? He has instead decreed that the believers should live to teach the faith, and has exalted the reward of teaching to that of martyrdom. And there's several instances where, for example, in the case of May Bowles, the mother of Ruhiya Khanum, who was designated as a martyr, even though she spent her last days going to, I think it was Argentina, where she almost immediately died. But in effect, she gave her life in teaching, as did many of the early teachers, such as Agnes Alexander, and of course, the most mighty teacher of them all, Martha Root. Notice they're all women. Not all of them, there are a few men involved, but mostly women. And so we conclude with this, the statement by Abdul Baha, who says in, it's Shoghi Effendi, that our present day, though he's quoting from Abdul Baha, that the master said that our test, the test of the people in the West, would not be physical like those of the Babis, but would be mental. And what did he mean by that? Well, not that we'd all go crazy necessarily, though many of us do, but that they would be mentally challenging. Can you decide what the correct path is in your life? Can you prioritize your life accordingly? And so that's it for tonight. And we're going to have some interesting classes ahead. And as we're getting, as you see, we're integrating more and more the teachings of the faith as we go along.